in the midst of a huge transformation where our peers, communities, and workplaces are all really melding into one. Welcome to Reimagining Company Culture. My name is Christina Giordano, and I'm a partnerships manager here at AllVoices, and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. Today, I'm excited to welcome our next guest onto the show, Rocki Howard. She is the Chief Diversity Officer at SmartRecruiters. Rocki, how's your day going?
Oh, my day is phenomenal, and I'm so glad to be here as part of it. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, of course. I'm so excited to speak with you. I have loads of questions for you, but if we want to start from the beginning, tell us a little bit about yourself. Be sure to include your pronouns. And also, I love to ask people, when you were younger, how did you answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up?
Yes. So my name is Rocki Howard. I am the Chief Diversity Officer at SmartRecruiters. I'm the host of the Voices of Diversity podcast. I identify as she, her, Black, Christian, Gen X, wife, mom. I'm a little untraditional in terms of how I identify because personally, I believe in multiple dimensions of diversity. And I believe in acknowledging multiple dimensions of diversity. I also believe all those things are part of my unique value proposition and how I show up in the world. And if you asked me when I was really young what I wanted to be, I wanted to be a dancer. I studied dance for 13 years. I grew up in the era of fame. I wanted to be Debbie Allen, right? That's what I wanted to be. And so now I'm so proud when I see people like Misty Copeland, right, who has really broken barriers as an African-American prima ballerina. But that's what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Amazing. I love that answer. It speaks to your creative genes as well. And you mentioned just believing in the multidimensional aspect of identity and diversity as well. How do you think your personal journey has really led you to be the Chief Diversity Officer at SmartRecruiters?
Yeah, I think lived experience is such an important part of what it not only your lived experience, but what you choose to do with your lived experience certainly can be a big part of your journey. For me, I think growing up as a darker skinned Black girl, where quite frankly, at a time where representation wasn't there for me, I couldn't pick up a magazine and see women, especially who look like me. I was born in the late 60s and the early 70s. You didn't see that in TV. You certainly didn't see it in a business setting. And the messaging around how I showed up in the world, a lot of negative connotations to that. There was a lot of negative connotations to being a darker skinned Black girl with quote unquote nappy hair. And I think about how that made me feel. And I think about what that did to my vision of who I could be when I grew up. And I thought about, as a wife and mother of four now, what I wanted for my children and what I wanted the world to be. So I think that's part one. I think part two, when I look at the larger picture, is as I grew into being a leader, I realized that not only could I make a way for other people, but I did. And that was an important part for me. And it was a responsibility and it was a pleasure. But there was also this wonderful positive outcome to company culture when you looked at things from a different way and you created cultures that represented multiple dimensions of diversity, and you created cultures that allowed those people to bring their whole selves to work. Now, there's lots of challenges with that as well, and it's not easy to do, but I could see the benefit. And I think for me specifically, being the Chief Diversity Officer at SmartRecruiters, there's two components to my role. One is making sure that our culture is a culture that is built on equity, inclusion, and belonging, where diversity is the expectation. And the second part of my role is the other big thing that led me to this particular position, is that I get to look at diversity through the lens of our customers and our industry and create opportunities and ways and create models for diversity maturity, hiring maturity, that say, this is how we help companies actually increase their ability to be able to hire diverse talent. Having come from 30 years in the TA and recruitment space, I have a lot of passion around that. And so that ability to be able to help multiple companies change how they're hiring was a road that I feel like I've been preparing for. So I think for me, it's been a combination of lived experience, learned experience, and functional experience that led me to where I am today. And certainly passion and quite frankly, a desire to just do the right thing and a desire for it not to be so dang on hard to just be who you are in the world.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I love that answer in terms of lived and learned experience. It sounds like you're really passionate about this work and really making spaces equitable as well, and a dynamic process. Like you said, it's not only about talent and representation, but it's about the processes, the vendors you work with. It's a 360-degree process as well. We know that over this past year, in terms of lived experiences, folks have been experiencing a tough time, but not only people in general, but especially women of color, Black women, Latinx women, especially in terms of statistics. We know that women are the lowest at the lowest point of workforce participation since 1988, according to one study. And there are a multitude of ways that companies are trying to mitigate this, whether it's returnships and making sure that they're providing for working parents as well. But I also wanted to ask, from your leadership perspective, how do you think companies can really kind of help mitigate these setbacks?
Right. Well, I think, first of all, they should ask the women that work for them. I think this is a step that we miss. I think when we see a problem, we start going outside of our own organizations and we're looking at the latest articles and we're doing all this research and we're looking for some magic checklist. And what we simply forget is to turn around to the people internally who are impacted by the issue and say, what do you need? How can I help and support? And so I think, again, that communication can mean a lot for people. I have questioned and bring to the table ideas like, does it really matter what time someone works? I mean, one of the things that I think we do as an organization is, obviously there are certain roles where you need to be there for a certain period of time, right? If I'm a help desk support person and I need to make sure that when Rocki calls because she's broken her computer again, I'm there between 8 and 5, right? But there are other roles where, you know what, do we really care what hours the person works? Or do I care that my P&Ls or have been prepared on time and I have them on the first of the month? So I think being flexible in terms of, and not to the point where we're like, oh, well, you agreed to work from 11 to 7, not 8 to 5. Here's the truth about the matter. When you are a caretaker and a primary caretaker, whether that be for your children, whether that be for your parents, whether that be for in my house, we call it the love children. We're the house where other kids show up.
Yeah.
You can't always predict when and how that's going to happen. You can't predict if a child is going to get sick. You can't predict when the parent-teacher conferences are going to be. But if you have flexibility and you're able to manage your time well, I think that's really important. I think it's also looking at what type of career pathing are we creating for women? And are we creating in general, not specifically for women, but I think we've all fallen into this false narrative of success looks like X. I need to climb the corporate ladder to be successful. I need to manage, 800 people globally. Otherwise, my MBA is invalidated. None of that is true. And I think looking at what pathways do we offer where people can operate from a position of their personal strength, but also operate from the place of their personal position and situation and still contribute meaningfully. I think it's also about, again, going back to the communication piece, not making assumptions on what someone can and cannot do. I've been in situations in the past where people have said, oh, well, we didn't even think to ask you if you'd be interested in that role because you have 4 kids. What does one
Yeah.
right? That's my choice to make. And what people
Right.
may not have known is that I have a non-traditional family. My husband is actually a much better stay-at-home parent than I am. And so there are no restrictions, but we
Right.
also make these assumptions for people. I think we also can't assume that all women have gone down a certain pathway. Some women choose not to have children. Some women choose not to do certain things. And so I, I really go back to the power of conversation and
Mhm.
asking people, are you at risk? How can I help and support you? Are we thinking about people's mental health? What can we do to support that? I think conversations could cure a lot of ills, and not only the ability to have the conversation and to listen, but to actually action it.
Absolutely. I think the power of two-way communication and not holding those assumptions is so important, especially for leaders who are strategizing plans that affect everybody at the company and at the office. And some people are afraid to get that feedback because it might not be what they envision or imagine. And I know in some surveys and studies, a lot of women of color at offices do not want to go back to an in-person workspace because there's a higher potential of microaggressions, if there's a higher potential not being supported by their manager for whatever reason. I wanted to ask you if you have kind of seen this also at SmartRecruiters and how you're thinking about this in terms of an equity strategy when people do get this feedback of actually I don't want to return to the office.
Yeah. Well, I think we're not dealing with it because of something very important. Smart Recruiters made a strategic decision more than a year ago, or about a year ago at this point, that we were going to be remote first, and
Mhm.
that was going to be our long-term strategy. So
Yeah.
there are other pieces of this cultural inclusion and belonging piece that we're working through, because that brings a different set of challenges. But what it doesn't breed is kind of that angst and fear of, I have to return to the office. And now that shield that potentially I had up, I'm really nervous about exposing myself to a higher level of microaggressions. And I think here's fundamentally the challenge, is that organizations need to first acknowledge that these things are happening. They need to acknowledge that they're happening to Black women. They need to acknowledge that they're happening to women. They need to acknowledge that they're happening to our people who are neurodiverse. They need to acknowledge that it's happening to people in our LGBTQ communities. They need to understand that we have social economic biases. There's so many biases we have that make people go, I don't want to stand around the water cooler and have a chat with you. And I think that's the fundamental place to start, is to have a realistic understanding of some of the things that go on in your culture, whether that be through doing, equity, inclusion, and belonging surveys. There is a wonderful equity index that's just come out that Shaker Recruitment is doing, and it's like the lived experience index. If you really want to know what's going on in your culture, then you need to invest in these types of things, and then you need to be honestly willing to address them.
Mhm. You need to be able to take action because once you build up that foundation of you feel, you trust the organization, you build up the psychological safety to give a candid feedback, whether it's to your manager anonymously or through, an annual survey, people are going to stop giving feedback if you don't do anything about it.
Absolutely. And it has to be ongoing. Like, one of the things that we do at Smart Recruiters is we do listening circles. And so sometimes we'll do facilitated listening circles. So when the Derek Chauvin verdict came down, for example, it was a very specific listening circle around, how do you feel about this? Let's show up. It's not recorded, there's no implications, and you get to really just kind of come and put it all on the table. But as an agreement for that, what we do is we kind of listen to, here are the 5 trends of what happened in this conversation that we really need to take away and hear what people are saying, and what are we going to do about it, right? And I think the challenge is for some companies, the actions that they're doing around DEIB are very performative, and they're focused externally. we are a diverse company. Here's what we're doing. CC, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, instead of going deeper and saying, I want to solve this issue. I want you to be able to show up at work without fear of, a microaggression, or in some places, just racism and bias.
Mm-hmm. And I think that goes to your point too of naming it and being specific, acknowledging what the current state of the workplace is and what needs improvement as well. I know you talked about the value of representation before and seeing someone who looks like yourself in leadership roles, in a C-suite role, and in these spaces that weren't historically built for women of color, for Black women. One of the topics that I wanted to talk to you about too is in regards to coaching and mentorship, because I think a lot of women of color have questions around managing up as a Black woman in the workplace, perhaps in an industry or, like tech or finance that is majority white. Do you have any advice for folks who are navigating that situation?
Yeah. I do think it has a lot to do with what situation you're in, because I think that how I do it in one organization may be completely different than how I do it in another.
Sure.
But this is what I would encourage all people to do, right? I think you have to look inside yourself and look at your own value system. Mm-hmm. And I think you need to set your personal boundaries. I think you need to be very deliberate about how you want to show up and what your brand is. And then I think, and you need to also be really clear on your value proposition to that particular organization. I think as women, as Black women, we are very susceptible to thinking, oh, well, maybe I'm not that good, or this idea didn't work, maybe I'm not. Don't do that. Be very clear about your value proposition, your outcomes. You have the seat at the table for a reason, but the seat isn't always enough. And so I think what we need to start thinking about is you can't always control how other people show up. You can control how you show up. And I think that there's the piece of this where you also have to think about, where's my line in the sand? What am I going to accept and what am I not going to accept? And then, to be honest, a lot of times when we're feeling in situations that feel a little bit uncomfortable, or we're feeling like we're not really well supported, what we tend to do is we kind of come into ourselves. And I think that's the time to really build relationships outside of yourself. Ask for support, ask for feedback, ask for people to come alongside of you. And so I think it's a combination of a lot of things, but I think most importantly, it's deciding how you want to show up, being clear on your value proposition, understanding where your personal lines are in the sand, deciding there is an option to leave. And I know that that is a privilege that not everyone has, but for many of us, we do have the privilege and we don't want to take it out of fear. So I think it's a very, I wish I had here's the checklist and this is what we do and here's the thing. I do have a great a book recommendation. It's Wild Hair by Tracy Edmonds, who is a former Fortune 500 executive and also chief diversity officer. And she tackles some of these things within her book. She calls them her wild hair moments. So I think it's a great resource.
Everyone wishes they had that magic wand as well, or that secret sauce to these big questions as well. But I think knowing your worth and your value proposition, like you talked about, is a really important piece of it. And also talking to mentors, talking to your personal board of directors, and bringing people along with you too, your peers as well, and negotiating. I know people talk about their BATNA, their best alternative offer and things like that. So just being honest with yourself to see if you do have the privilege of leaving is important. I wanted to ask you too, who your mentor or mentors was, and what's your ideal model for mentorship. I'm sure a lot of folks are reaching out to you to either be their mentors informally or formally, but what does that look like in your eyes?
Yeah. I've been really lucky to have multiple people mentor and support me throughout my career. And, I think there were, people who like back in the day when I was a young recruiter and couldn't see people like me, there were a couple of entrepreneurs who were really big deals at that time, that owned Black-owned staffing companies, that took time for, a little girl who didn't see many people like her to just talk to. That one of them I still have a relationship with today. Ray Pearson over at Alpha Ray Personnel, I could call Ray right now, and I literally met her when I was 21 years old. And if I called Ray right now, and I'm 52, she would take the call. And so I think it's people like that who make time for the next generation. I've worked for some great leaders that have not been afraid to give me the tough feedback. I do think that we have to be really clear on the difference between mentors and sponsors. Sponsors there are people who will coach and help develop you and be that kind of back and forth thought partner with you, help you develop. And then there are sponsors who will actually make space for you at a table. So, for example, I'm in this seat today because one of my sponsors introduced me to the CEO at SmartRecruiters and made space for me at a table. So I appreciate you, Mike Bagelman. I appreciate you. So there are differences between mentors and sponsors. I think when I have people, and I do have several people that I mentor, and it's my joy and my pleasure, but I always say I'm not the mentor that, quite frankly, is going to smile and grin and blow smoke up your ass. Like that's not what I'm going to do. This is not a make you feel good about yourself relationship. Like if you tell me you want to get here and you want help and guidance to get there, then we're going to do the work to get you there. And sometimes that is going to be, like all the love and support you need. And I'm going to prop you up when you can't stand by yourself. And sometimes that's just going to be a good old fashioned tail kicking and saying, get over yourself. This isn't what you're doing. You need to go do the work. You need to do that. It is. So I look for mentees who are willing to do the work and who are willing to move themselves forward. Like if I'm mentoring someone and I find myself repeating the same things over and over again, I feel like that's the definition of insanity. You're doing the same thing over and over again, and you're expecting a different result. And I honestly find time a larger investment than I do money. So I value my time, and I value other people's time. So for me, that best relationship is to talk about why do you want to be mentored? Why is it me? It may not be me. Let's talk about what that looks like. Let's talk about the commitments we're going to make to each other. I think the other thing that I would tell you is I learn as much from the people that I mentor as I give to them. And it's a wonderful reciprocal relationship.
It's a mutual relationship, like you said, and just the power of having someone believe in you, but also give you that constructive feedback, because that is a place where you grow. And the difference between sponsorship and mentorship is really important. I'm sure a lot of people come to you in terms of mentorship or just questions around your experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion, whether it's recruitment, talent, in your role right now in terms of a strategic partner. Are there any kind of myths you want people to understand around DEI that you want to dispel right now that you either get a lot of questions around, or it's just you're seeing out in the world, so not necessarily at SmartRecruiters?
I want to dispel the myth that you have the right to be diversity fatigued. This is a term that I'm starting to hear that honestly makes me really angry. And I feel like it's a slap in the face to all the people who have been historically excluded from multiple dimensions of diversity for years. So I think what that says to me is that diversity is perceived as a trend.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So there's this whole set of people who have been hired, myself included, although I'm not I don't feel like I'm in the trendy piece, but there's a whole, like, I was just doing some research for a speech I'm giving, and I believe that diversity roles have increased like 75% over the last year.
Yeah.
And what's happening now is we've now been in that cycle for a little bit more than a year, and people are like, I'm tired. Like, can't we move on to something else? And again, I think what that says is you've never quite understood that this isn't a trend. This is a commitment. So I think that that's one thing I would like to do. Like, this is, you can't fix diversity with one solution. It's not going to be one piece of technology. It's not going to be, kind of one training that you do. It's not going to be one hire, even if it's a chief diversity officer. It is a long-term commitment that requires systemic heart and mind change within an organization that's constantly being moved forward. And so I think that's a myth that I would certainly like to put out there. I'd also like to probably talk about the fact that you think that your chief diversity officer or whoever heading up diversity actually owns diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in your organization. That is absolutely incorrect. They may be the person who's the chief advocate. They may be the chief driver. They may own the budget. They may be the internal expert, but they don't own diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Everyone in an organization does. And if we don't take that perspective, again, we're not going to see long-term change. And while we talk about the ownership, the other thing that I think we need to talk a little bit about is what ownership looks like at every level of the organization, right? So I think when I think about things that I'd like to myth bust, certainly those are a couple things. I could go on for hours, but those are a couple of things that are at the top of my list.
I think that is a +1 to all 3 points that you mentioned. But I think in terms of a lot of people, and I'm seeing so many job postings for a diversity, equity, inclusion program manager, chief diversity officer, that is a lot for one person to shoulder if you are expecting them to make your entire organization equitable. It's just not feasible, and it's setting up not for success too. And in order to have systemic change, you need to have everybody's buy-in as well. So I definitely agree with that. I do want to jump into SmartRecruiters diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy to see how you're thinking about kind of the holistic approach to this long-term commitment. And also, so many folks have questions around how do we measure success or our progress over year to year, especially when folks are like, I don't want it to be a box to be checked to say we did this training or we did X number of trainings or we hired this many people. What does really success look like to you?
Yeah. So for me, when I think about what we do internally, so I'm going to put aside the part of my role that really creates strategy. So I guess I'll mention one quick thing. I do believe in diversity, hiring, and maturity. I think that is we've created this model that really is about 4 key pillars. It's about thinking about your diversity, brand equity, sourcing strategically, fair and equitable hiring processes, and organizational support. That's the core of where we think about it. So when we think about our diversity, hiring, and maturity, that's a core part of our overall strategy, is to improve those things in our organization. And I'll be really honest, because I think this is a core part of it too, that people get really uncomfortable for. In our maturity model, we have, there's 4 stages, from starting at diversity talent aware to becoming a diversity talent ally. I wrote it, and our organization is still only in phase 2. So I think it's about long-term strategic commitment and how your organization evolves, right? When I looked at SmartRecruiters, what I wanted to do is to take some time to get to know our organization and to get to know the people and to really think about what made sense in our organization. So we have taken a slower approach, quite frankly, to changing the narrative within our organization, but I believe we've taken an authentic and systemically sustainable approach as well. So what we did is we took a step back. We then trained every leader in our organization to get a common language around what it means to be an inclusive leader. We did that based on Jennifer Brown's book, How to Be an Inclusive Leader. And so then once we had every leader in our organization that understood, as a leadership team, we then looked at all of our systemic processes and said, this is where we know that we've got gaps, and this is preventing our culture from being what it is. And so we have those gaps as part of a long-term strategy to be able to affect change. We then surveyed our organization and said, you tell us how you think we're doing.
Yeah.
And we wanted to do that kind of ahead of doing major issues within the organization, and you tell us what you need. And so then, like I said, we've started very slowly. So our goal is to increase our diversity hiring maturity, increase that satisfaction in terms of our internal DEIB score. But most importantly, I think for me, it's about every time someone comes to us and says, because of the work you're doing and the doors that you're opening up. So we started programming. We do education through Slack and postings about various things that are going on. We've started 2 ERGs in our organization. We have monthly programming that is about lunch and learns. We do our listening circles monthly. We've started a diversity council with a little bit of a different twist, because we have kind of events, but we also have a committee that's focused on education and peer-to-peer diversity education. And we also have a global advocacy committee that says we need people from all of our regions. If we're going to be better together, then we need all of us to tell us from the different regions, where are your challenges from a diversity perspective and how can we support you? And so then let's bring that into an overarching model. My answer to companies who ask me, how should I measure my diversity outcomes? For me, it's really simple. Are you actually improving representation at all levels? Like, let's not make it complicated. Either you've got more women or you don't.
Yeah.
Black people or you're not. You see more Latinx or you don't. You see more LGBTQ, insert any dimension of diversity. Either you are or you aren't. It's a really simple measure. We want to make it really complex. Either you are and aren't seeing that number increase at all levels of the organization, especially your leadership. And then how are people feeling about working for you? Do your people feel good? It doesn't have to be perfect, but are they proud? And to me, it's really just that simple.
I think that's so important to recognize. There are simple ways to just really measure the success of what you're doing. And especially in terms of all levels, I think a lot of companies, which is great, are focusing on the beginning of the career, more junior levels, but managers, C-level, board of directors are really important too, because they're in decision-making seats and they're hiring managers as well. I guess on the opposite end, I know I asked about, common diversity, equity, inclusion myths, but is there something that you hope that companies and individuals, whether it's leaders or a group of folks, really integrate into their strategy so they are successful in the next year and years to come?
Yeah. So again, I'll go back to our hiring maturity model, right? And we are actually about to come out with a state of diversity hiring report where we're going to give quite a few recommendations on this is what we see and what's not seeing. But what I will say off the top of my head is, one, please be committed. And here's an example of that. I see companies all the time that say, I want to increase our representation by X percent. When we when we do a pretty extensive assessment of diversity, hiring, maturity, 64% of our respondents, when asked if they had the right budget to meet their diversity hiring goals, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. So put your money where your mouth is thing number one. I think it's only 13% of our respondents have a clear strategy for recruiting the specific talent and a sourcing strategy for recruiting the specific type of talent they want to see in their organization. So again, you can't just sit and like pluck people off the magic diversity tree. Like there has to be resources put behind that. And I think the third thing I'd really like to see people do for sustainable change is any business problem that I've seen resolved, it's been resolved because leaders have it as part of their performance goals and their bonus payouts. So let's make leaders accountable throughout the organization for this change in this evolution.
I love that, because that's not only a nice to have for an organization, you're really operationalizing it and building it into the processes to make sure that equity is built into these systems as well. And that goes back to your point about systemic change and changing the hearts and minds of folks at a company as well. We recognize that not everybody is perfect. Like you mentioned, we're all at different parts of our journey in this internal work with a capital W, but is there a company or individual who is really exemplary in the work they're doing, cultivating an equitable workplace, of course, outside of SmartRecruiters?
You know what? I think we're all on a particular journey, but I will give a shout to Gabby and the team at Abercrombie and Fitch right now. They are just doing some incredible work. And when you look at the work that they're doing, it is not only kind of internal but external. You know, they've kind of restructured their brand. They've got capsule collections. They're doing training internally. At all levels of the organization, you can see diverse hiring. They're investing in the communities. What they're doing is taking a holistic approach. And Gabby, their head of diversity over there, she does an incredible job with her team. I am very biased. They are a SmartRecruiters customer, and we have a ton that are doing great things. But that's just one example of someone who I think is doing it really well.
Amazing. We love a good shout out as well, and just praising people for the work that they're doing on this journey. So I always like to ask. And before we close out our conversation, I feel like I could talk to you for hours. But is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to share with our audience who is listening, or one or two key takeaways they hope they take with them after they listen to this episode?
I think one of the things that I always ask my guests is, if I on my podcast, it is, what could people who want to be good allies do better? What could they start doing today? And so I think I'll take a version of that, right? And if you want to see this work sustained, if this is important to you, what can you do today? And I would say do the work, educate yourself. And make a commitment to where you show up. You may not be able to support everything. No, it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about know your value prop. Like, for example, I'm not a person who's you're not going to find me at a protest rally. That's not where my value prop is. That's not what I do really well. That doesn't mean that I don't have a place in this fight and that I can't show up and I can't make a difference. Difference is made in diversity space, I believe, one conversation, one action at a time. Do the work, understand where your value is, have the conversation, commit to an action, rinse, repeat.
Incredible. I love that call to action. Know your worth and know what you can bring to the table and part of this conversation. And it does start internally as well. When you want to achieve all of these goals and strategies that we're talking about tangibly, you really need to reconcile what you are, what you're doing, what you're committed to internally as well. Rocki Howard, thank you so much for being on Reimagining Company Culture. It was an absolute pleasure to speak with you this afternoon.
Well, it was an absolute honor to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and trusting me with your audience. Thank you so much.
Yes, absolutely. And as a reminder for folks who are listening, AllVoices believes in the empowerment of everyone to speak up at an organization, and we know it's a requirement for the company to succeed. Have a good rest of your afternoon, everyone.